Well, to break down all these issues, I'm joined now by Christine Fair, Associate Professor at Georgetown University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, with these latest attacks, a lot of people were wondering why Brussels? But as we've seen, there was a growing trend towards extremism in that city, in Brussels. Now, given the history and the warning signs, was this inevitable?
So I think you kind of captured the structural problems with Brussels in your opening remarks. I think there was another interesting historical event that folks haven't focused upon of late, and that is that in the late 1960s, Molenbeek was actually leveled by a fire, and it happened to take place during the time when the King of Saudi Arabia was visiting. And he made a very handsome donation to the victims. At the same time, there's also an oil crisis. And so as a sort of, thank you, the Belgian government invited the Saudis to build a very large mosque in Molenbeek. It was huge, and they brought labor to actually build it. And then they insisted, of course, not on having local imams, but actually bringing imams from Saudi Arabia. And so over time, this neighborhood simply transformed into what it is. And so you lay that on top of with the things that you noted. I mean, for example, you have the ethnic division between the Walloons and the Flemish. You have 3 languages that are in use. You have local police departments that are right next to each other, but because of the Flemish-Walloon divide, they don't even pass information on to each other. And then, as you said, Belgium has been long known as a place where you go and you get arms. And of course, since the 1990s, a lot of these weapons are actually being brought in from the Balkans. So it's a combustible mix, as you noted yourself.
Now, Brussels isn't alone when it comes to some of these migrant ghettos that have evolved from some of these populations that have now become alienated. So help us understand the significance of this, because a lot of them have been ignored by the state.
So I think every country really needs to be looked at differently. So I've spent quite a bit of time looking, for example, at the United Kingdom. Pakistanis and Bangladeshis have both gone to fight ISIS. There have been longstanding ties to South Asian jihadi organizations. France has an enormous problem. And what France and the UK both have in common is that they have a colonial relationship with the populations that are now being radicalized. In both the case of the UK and France, it's very difficult for these Muslim communities to rise socially in status. And I think this is something that the United States does, I think, much better than either of those countries. And then, obviously, the self-reinforcing ghettoization of many of these communities in large European cities. But I think it's important that we look at the particular history of each country and sort of understand what is the historical relationship between the state and those communities. I think that's really important.
Now, Kristen, I do want to add, when it comes to that sense of belonging, a lot of people are turning to social networks, and that's also how some of these terror groups are really connecting with people. What sort of role do you think that plays?
So, the groups that I study, which are not explicitly ISIS, except when ISIS operates in South Asia, not all groups actually function that way. The groups that I study in South Asia, they're very traditional recruiting, face-to-face. They will go to schools. In fact, they function. My brothers are military recruiters for the U.S. Army. I see a lot of similarities. But obviously, with ISIS, and especially when we're looking at diasporan recruits, social media plays a really huge role in these so-called black nets. So the complexity of this, goes without saying. But I think going back to the European problem, we think about the United States, we are really one nation. We have a lot more ability to have our different law enforcement and intelligence agencies interoperate. And by the way, it's been very difficult after 9/11 to make that happen. Imagine trying to make that happen across the expanse of the EU. Intelligence agencies, by design, don't want to cooperate.
Now, Christine, thinking of these intelligence agencies and looking at the lessons that we can learn from Brussels, what should countries be looking at now?
Well, look, I think the reality is these attacks are very easy to carry off in some sense, especially when you have a state like Belgium that hasn't been functioning as a state for a long time. It's not a coincidence that the Paris attacks were actually planned in Belgium. France has very robust counterterrorism measures. So I think what we really need to be thinking about is really domestic law enforcement. And this is where, when you have presidential candidates like Trump, for example,
Right.
engaging in very alienating rhetoric. This is really counterproductive. Let's take the United States, for example. We've had several cells. I live in Virginia. We had a Virginia cell of individuals that went to Pakistan. And we knew about that because the parents actually came to law enforcement. When the community itself doesn't have a functioning relationship with law enforcement,
Right.
we really don't have an effective way. Then it all comes down to intelligence, right? And that's a much more difficult game to play than law enforcement in some ways.
So it sounds like a more holistic approach is needed. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Christine Fair from Georgetown University.
Thank you for having me.